In today's lecture, I'm going to begin with a definition of the elegy and then look at its characteristics. Following this, I'm going to talk about the differences between the classical elegy and the romantic elegy. Finally, I will tell you about the emphasis on the poetic persona in Thomas Gray's elegy. Right? So we are going to do at least three objectives that we have for this lecture. So to begin with, what is an elegy? Here's a quick and simple definition. An elegy is a poem of serious reflection, especially one mourning the loss of someone who has died. And now, elegies are defined by their subject matter and don't have to follow any specific form in terms of meter, rhyme, or structure. Some additional key details about elegies that you need to know about would be: first of all, elegies focus on the emotional experience of the poet, and hence they are generally written in the first person, right? So this is something I have spoken about in the previous lecture. I mentioned there that the first person narrator was not in vogue during the neoclassical era. Neoclassical authors and poets did not use the first person narrator, right? But in the romantic elegy, that persona has returned again. The I or the ego is being used again, has become the center of the poem. Okay, second key feature. So typically, elegies end on a somewhat hopeful note, right? With the poet reconciling himself or herself to the death and ultimately discovering some form of consolation. The third important detail about elegy is that there is a poetic form which is known as the elegiac stanza, and this has a specific meter and also a very specific rhyme scheme. But elegiac stanza is not the same thing as elegy. So these three important details that you need to know before moving on and studying Gray's elegy, right? So you see, for modern and contemporary poets, the elegy is a poem that deals with subjects of death or mortality, but has no set form, meter, or rhyme scheme. Now, while modern elegies don't have to use any particular meter or don't have to follow any particular form, they do typically follow a specific thematic arc, right? So what is this thematic arc? Often it is moving from grief toward an acceptance of the death, right, of whoever has died. So many elegies initially express grief and sorrow, which the poet works through over the course of the poem before arriving at a consolatory conclusion, right, about the inevitability and universal nature of death, right? So this is a sort of pattern. It begins with grief and sorrow, and then during the course of the poem, the poet finally comes in terms with, or is finally able to accept the death of the person who has passed away, and also to accept that death is inevitable and is going to come to all, right? Death the equalizer. So oftentimes the poet will find a silver lining in mourning by alluding to, sometimes, as in the case of many English elegies, sometimes by alluding to the Christian notion that death marks the beginning of an eternal afterlife in heaven, right? So that motive often is present in elegies towards the end of the poem, right? So the poet comes in terms, is able to accept the death of the person who has passed away, also talks about the inevitability of death, and also finds a sort of silver lining in realizing that death is actually the beginning of an eternal afterlife in heaven, right? Now, a bit of history about the elegy, and then we'll talk about the classical elegy and also the romantic elegy as well. So, for most of history, the term elegy did not have any special relationship to the subject of grief or mortality as it does today. So, now when we think of elegy, we associate it with a sad poem, a poem about mourning, a poem about grief or sorrow of mortality, right? But that was not the case when the word elegy was used by ancient Greek and Latin poets, right? So, what was the case in ancient Greek and Latin poetry? In ancient Greek and Latin verse, the elegy was a poetic form that was defined by a particular metrical pattern called elegiac couplets. Right? So I spoke about elegiac stanza a little while earlier, right? And I told you that elegiac stanza and elegy are not the same thing. So in ancient Greece, they had a very defined, they had a particular metrical pattern called elegiac couplets. And some of the most famous elegies in ancient Greece or ancient Rome were written by poets such as Catullus and Ovid. Now, you have surely heard about Ovid. If you read the Metamorphoses in semester 1, so you must be familiar with that name. So, Ovid also wrote elegies, but these elegies were not the same kind of elegies that have come down to us, right? So, Ovid's elegies and Gray's elegy are very different. When Ovid was writing his elegies, the term elegy was not related or not associated with grief or mortality, right? It even had a defined pattern, it had a metrical standard which the poet was trying to follow. But but the romantic elegy and contemporary or modern elegy, that is very different. It is by default it is associated with grief or mortality or sorrow, right? And it does not have any predefined metrical pattern, right? Now let's come to English literature. We spoke about the classics, about Ovid and Catullus. Now let's talk about English literature. So in English literature, in contrast to this classical, tradition of elegy writing, in English literature, elegies are not defined by their use of the elegiac meter, as in the case of ancient Greek and Latin elegies. In fact, until the 16th century, right? 16th century is the century where Shakespeare lived, right? Shakespeare died in early 17th century, but most of his life was spent during the 16th century. So, in fact, until the 16th century, the definition of elegy in English literature remained somewhat indeterminate, right? Indeterminate means vague. So it was not properly defined. When people use the word elegy, they were not really sure about what they were speaking about, right? It was just a term which did not have any clear meaning at that time. And it was often in the 16th century taken simply to mean a poem of serious reflection. You see, even in the 16th century, it was not associated with grief or mortality. It was just a poem about reflection. Someone sits and meditates on a particular topic. Now, or whether that meditation is about death or mortality was not yet defined in the 16th century. But during the 16th century, the elegy eventually, from its vague and indeterminate definition, it eventually gained a more defined, a more specific definition as a poem of grief and lamentation. So it is only in the 16th century, towards the end of the 16th century, that we see that the elegy is slowly and gradually being associated with grief and mortality, and sorrow, right? And death, of course. So even though this association started somewhere in the 16th century, it was only in the 18th century when English literature finally, had a proper place for elegy. Because it was only in the 18th century that the elegy started to flourish, not just exist, but actually flourish. Now, this act of elegy writing was, became particularly common among the English Romantic poets, beginning with, of course, our hero Thomas Gray. So, why? Because he valued the elegy for its personal and emotional qualities, right? So, not just Thomas Gray, of course, but all the Romantic poets who took interest in the elegy form, they valued the elegy because of that personal meditative nature, right? And they made that meditative nature more pointed, and they pointed it at sorrow, death, mortality, loss, all of these things, right? So they loved this personal and emotional quality it had, right? In the previous lecture, I already told you that neoclassical literature was more so about weight, decorum, logic, reasoning, and romantic is more so about personal and emotional qualities, right? So naturally, uh, it became a prominent form. The elegy became a prominent form in the romantic era, at least definitely in the transition period, and a little more in the during the time when Wordsworth was writing. So so you see, 18th century romantic poets even reinvented the traditional elegiac stanza, which I told you previously about. And they defined it as a quatrain. Quatrain is a four-line stanza. And according to them, according to this tradition, they reinvented it and they started this tradition wherein there would be quatrains in iambic pentameter, right? And they would also follow a very specific rhyme scheme, which would usually be AB, AB. All right. Now that we have spoken about a bit of the historical background of the elegy in ancient times and also in English literature, now let's take a look at the differences between the classical elegy and the tradition of elegy writing that Thomas Gray started. So the key feature of modern elegiac tradition that uh, Thomas Gray started was the death of persons, or in some cases animals, who are too low or too vulgar or too obscure to be celebrated by the more traditional elegy, right? Because the ancient elegiac tradition is concerned with what Aristotle called epideicretic rhetoric, right? And that is, what does that mean? What is this complex term, epideictic rhetoric? What does this mean? This is a term from Aristotle, and why am I referring to it here? You see, in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, elegy was not written about any random person. It was written about some illustrious person, about someone who was great. Great meaning some king or queen or knight, right? Or important politician, something like that. So in ancient times, the elegies that were written were in praise of these people, praise of important or prominent citizens, right? Or prominent people, not just citizens, also kings and queens and knights, like I told you, right? Therefore, you see, the subjects of the traditional elegy are usually not the eminent members of the society, right? Because in the tradition that Thomas Gray started, elegies are written about ordinary people, right? So in the classical, it is written about important people such as kings, queens, knights, war heroes, etc. Not ordinary people, but in the traditional elegy, it becomes the subject matter of the poem concerns ordinary people, like a friend who may not be the prime minister or who may not be the king of the country, right? You see, so about ordinary people, that was the tradition that Thomas Gray started. So, in the classical tradition of elegiac poetry, the poet usually attempts to focus the reader's attention on the fame and great deeds of important men and women. But this is not the case with the romantic elegy, which Thomas Gray started. And like I said, it becomes about ordinary people, someone maybe he knew, right? Someone who was his friend, right? Something like that. So, not important people. So, Thomas Gray, arguably for the first time in English literature, rejects this tradition of lamenting for the rich and famous, right? With this one poem, that is Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, Gray revised the tradition of elegy writing altogether. Not only did he start mourning for ordinary people, such as his deceased friend, who was, remember, neither a king nor a very important person, but Thomas Gray also made a highly influential technical emotional shift by relocating the focus of the elegy from the deceased to himself. Right? So, again, let me try and explain this to you with a visual cue. So, imagine we are talking about the classical elegy. We are talking about the classical elegy, and imagine that there's the poet and the person who has died. So, in the classical elegy, the poem would be about someone who was important. You already know that, a king or a queen. But also, the the lament in the poem would be about the person who has died. But when Thomas Gray writes the poem in Thomas Gray's elegy, once again there is Thomas Gray and the people who have died, his deceased friend, or all the ordinary people who have died and whom he talks about. But in Thomas Gray's elegy, the sorrow is turned inward. In other words, the focus is not on the person who has died, but the focus is on the person who is writing the poem. So, the focus or the locus of Thomas Gray's elegy is on his own sorrow about people who have died, right? So, please note this important distinction. And this tradition, which Thomas Gray started, was pursued by Cowper, who was Gray's contemporary, and especially, more importantly, that is by William Wordsworth, who, remember, was the high priest of the Romantic poetry. Right, Romantic poetry at its, at its best or at its highest point has not yet come when Thomas Gray is writing, but Thomas Gray, remember, is one of the transition poets. And he is so influential that even Wordsworth is interested in this elegiac form and he writes in the same tradition, right? And these people together, Thomas Gray and then Cowper and William Wordsworth, they form a very important part of modern poetics. And like I told you in the previous lecture, this important part of modern poetics, it leads directly to the work of many modern poets. And I had named two of these poets in the previous lecture. So one was Wallace Stevens, modern American poet, and again another modern American poet, Edgar Lee Masters. Right? These are excellent poets who have also written the elegy, who have continued to write in Thomas Gray's tradition. They have written about ordinary people and they have turned the sorrow inward. Right? In other words, they have mourned not for the person, not just for the person who has died, but the sorrow is about the poet himself or herself lamenting the death of someone, right? Now, this choice of ordinary people, low or obscured people, is an essential part of the change of focus initiated by Thomas Gray. In the first lecture of this series, I told you that Gray wrote his elegy over several years. And the poem that we read today is the culmination of his experiments, where he changes the focus in elegy from the deceased, that is from the person who has died, to the I or ego of the first person poet or narrator. Right? Now this tendency is evident in all of Gray's work from the sonnet on the death of Richard West. I had mentioned this in the first lecture, right? This sonnet, and this poem, this poem, sonnet on the death of Richard West, also focuses on the grieving I, that is, on Gray himself rather than the deceased. I will just read a few lines from this poem to show you where this tendency started in Thomas Gray. So, in Sonnet on the Death of Richard West, I'll just read 4 random lines. He says, "In vain to me the smiling mornings shine, these years, alas, for other notes repine. A different object do these eyes require, my lonely anguish melts no heart but mine." You need to note here that what Gray developed as an essential feature of the Romantic elegy was the change of focus. Change of focus from what? From the body of the person who has died. To what? To the events occurring in the mind of the poetic persona who is contemplating that death. Like I said before, the real breakthrough in this shift of focus became complete in elegy written in a country churchyard. He started with the sonnet written on the death of Richard West, but this project that he started with that poem, it culminated when he completed writing elegy written in a country churchyard. Right? So remember, as I was saying, very important point, that the focus of Thomas Gray's elegy is on himself. Right? He is the protagonist of the poem. The protagonist of the poem is not the person who has died. That was the case in the classical elegy. In the classical elegy, the protagonist of the poem was the person who had died, who would be a king or queen or a very important person. In the Romantic elegy started by Thomas Gray, someone has died, yes. That person is being mourned, yes. but the protagonist of the poem is the poet. The poet is the person who is dying out of sorrow, you see, and the poet is the person who finally realizes that death is inevitable and that everyone must one day die, and there is a silver lining in the fact that after this person has died, he is going to a better place, right? But remember that the locus, the center of the poem, is the poet himself, Thomas Gray himself, not the person who has died. Through this single poem, elegy, Thomas Gray made a dramatic change in the entire elegiac genre. Right, the low origin or the low or ordinary origin of the people who have died, who are celebrated in his poem, was being done for the first time. But there is something even more revolutionary. What is that? Even more revolutionary is the fact that the poet claims no connection with those who are being mourned. Right? You see, when ancient poets were writing their elegies, like I told you, they are writing about great people. Now, they may not have known those great people personally, right? So, if Ovid was writing a poem about some deceased king, it is possible that Ovid personally did not know the king, but it is generally accepted that the king is an important person. But Thomas Gray is writing about ordinary people. He is writing about a farmer who has died. He is writing about his friend who no one knows about. He is writing about, say, an ordinary schoolmaster who has died, right? So he is talking about these uh, people who are unknown, obscure. He repeatedly tells us that these people who have died are, his words in the poem, unknown, obscure, lowly, and anonymous, right? And this facilitates the shift in emphasis from the deceased to the mourner, right? Since he does not know the people who have died, I mean, since he personally does not know the people he has died, except maybe his friend, it becomes easier for the poet to shift the center of the poem from the people who have died to himself. Right? Like I told you, that the emphasis or the protagonist of the poem is the author, the poet himself. So that becomes easy because he personally does not know most of the people who have died. So, since the dead invoked are only vaguely or obscurely imagined, it is inevitable that the scene should shift to the I in the act of imagining them. And the beginning of the poem, or the I, who wanders in a dim pastoral scene. I'll just read a few lines, the first few lines of elegy. He says, "The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd, the lowing herd winds slowly over the lea. The ploughman homeward prods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me." Observe that the me or I becomes the locus or the center of the entire poem. That is one of the major differences between classical and romantic elegy, right? There was no I in the classical elegy, but this I becomes the center of Thomas Gray's poem. What is the fourth line? "And leaves the world to darkness and to me." So I have become the center now, and as I was saying, this I persona, this ego or me, is the locus or the central point of the poem. Around that orbits everything else. So, for today's lecture, I will conclude by leaving you with the thought that Thomas Gray started writing what some scholars, such as John Dolan, have called the self-centered elegy. Right? So, that is the quality of the romantic elegy. It's very personal. It's self-centered. So, I'll leave you with this thought. And in the fourth lecture, in the next one, we are going to talk about a few more aspects of this text, a few more thematic aspects.